Hello, friends. Guess what? It's the year 2017. It's not the year 1967. That means you have to support all of these various media outlets and channels that you find yourself sucking up every second of the day, listening to all your favorite podcasts, reading all your favorite blogs, because the previous gateholders who control the three main television networks of the 60s are no longer beholden to your brains and all of your input receptors. Back then, all of the advertisers that you saw on those three channels could just suck up into your nostrils, down your throat, and into your heart because they controlled the waves. Today, everyone controls it. So, podcasts like this need your support. Please go to zachleary.com and use the Amazon portal to buy your stuff or buy a t-shirt or something. Thanks. It's all happening. 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 It's all Hello, friends. Welcome to the podcast. It's all happening with Zach Leary. That's me, your host. This week, we have a return guest to the podcast, Danny Goldberg, who is the author of the new book, In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967, and the Hippie Idea. Yes, so it is 2017. It's the 50th anniversary of 1967 and the Summer of Love. The Summer of Love was really a term invented by the media. Like if you were in San Francisco and experiencing the Summer of Love at the time, you weren't necessarily calling it the Summer of Love. That's something that kind of happened after the fact. And by the end of 1967, it had all basically turned into like a degenerate-filled, media sensationalized mess anyway. But at the same time, it was an amazing time to be part of the hippie revolution. And this podcast is going to explore why those times were so important. I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from the book. In the late 60s, in the balance between politics, culture, and consciousness, politics was an even bigger deal in most black communities than in the white world. The draft affected millions of white men, but if you had money, you could drag out your college deferment or find the right psychiatrist. If you were black, regardless of your age or gender or economic status, you couldn't avoid the realities derived from hundreds of years of slavery and Jim Crow's subjugation. Elections and laws had extra impact on African Americans. As Martin Luther King Jr. explained, they say you can't legislate morality. And that's true, but you can regulate behavior. A law cannot make a man love me, but it can prevent him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. 1967 was 4 years after Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, 3 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and 2 years after the Voting Rights Act was signed into law. In November 1966, Edward Brooke, a moderate Republican from Massachusetts, became the first ever African-American elected by popular vote in the United States Senate. Yet millions of black Americans were still treated as second-class citizens, and many had run out of patience. At great cost, including the death of many civil rights workers and 4 young schoolgirls, there had been integration of lunch counters and buses, and voter registration of African Americans had begun in the South. But patterns of discrimination in housing, employment, banking, and the criminal justice system persisted in both the North and the South, and the wounds of generations of racist orthodoxy festered. That's from In Search of the Lost Chord. So I felt like reading that passage, not to pick sort of a heavy passage, but the last chunk of it was sort of demonstrative and illustrative of institutional racism and sort of how those things were born. Yes, certain laws changed, and and African Americans could rise up and become, like I say, a senator from Massachusetts. But there are still many systemic problems within housing laws and employment possibilities. And now we're seeing voter rights registration and voter access laws again becoming more restrictive. So, institutional racism, of course, it can dance around the laws and whatnot, but it is still a very big and thick and firmly entrenched problem within the United States of America, and sort of part of the issue that we find ourselves in today, and why we are seeing so much tension and the problems today, in the world today, I should say. But anyway, if you're too young to remember 1967, I sure as hell am. I wasn't around then. But the impact that this time had on you even today is immeasurable. The music that you listen to, the way that you dress, the type of foods that you eat, the politics that you may or may not be into, but that you're at least aware of, the environmental movement, the sexual revolution, women's rights, African-American rights, they all, really stemmed from this very fertile time in American culture. And it can't be escaped. And I'm recording this intro actually from just a few hours before Dead & Company at Shoreline in Mountain View, California. The preeminent psychedelic band whose core, or their augmented core, I should say, is still alive and well and still playing this music that's as important as ever. So there you go. 60s are still alive and well in some ways, but we've forgotten a lot of the core lessons, and it's time to not forget them. So, Danny Goldberg, I hope you enjoy the podcast. The book is out now, and Danny's a good friend, a brother, and a great mind, and I hope you enjoy it.
See that girl barefoot in the lawn, whistling and singing, she's carrying on, and laughing in her eyes, dancing in her feet. She's a neon light line, and she dance on the street. Hey, 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 coming by every day. Hey, 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 coming by every day. Well, everybody's dancing.
Danny Goldberg, welcome back to the podcast, I should say. How's it going, man?
Hey, it's going pretty good, Zach.
Nice.
It's all happening. In fact.
It's all happening. Yes. Great to have you back. You were here well over a year ago, in some of the early episodes of the podcast. It's changed a lot. Thank you so much for coming back. You have a new book out called In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967 and the Hippie Idea, and it is 2017, so it makes it the 50th anniversary of the year 1967. So this is kind of the generic, obvious opening question, but why? What was it inside of you that kind of possessed you to revisit that year and to go back?
Well, I've long felt that the way a lot of the media writes about or covers the 60s, whether it's CNN documentaries or History Channel or Time Magazine or those kind of things, has not really reflected what I remember about it. I graduated from high school in 1967, so the book that I wrote is not a memoir. It's like a journey to all the things that I thought were so amazing at that time that kind of affected and inspired me, that I wasn't quite old enough or cool enough to be directly part of. And the thing about 67 is, to me, it was sort of the peak year of the hippie part of it, because the 60s are so many different pieces of it, and most of what's lasted in a lot of the media is the protest aspects, yep. Which are organic thing. Every 25 million males, between 18 and 35 or 40 were subject to the draft. It was a war that many of us felt was not rational or particular or moral, and but the protests weren't the only thing going on. There was this other wave of energy that was related in part to psychedelics, in part to kind of the coming of age of the baby boom generation, who was by then more than 20 years after World War II, and questioning some of the post-war values. And
of course, music.
It was the beginning of Eastern spirituality kind of entering the mainstream pop landscape, which a lot of that was through music, because the Beatles were the biggest thing in the world to a lot of us, and probably the most famous people in the world objectively. And they became interested in 67 in meditation. That was a word that years previous to that was only used in academia or small theological yoga type circles, and suddenly became on the front page of tabloids. And rock and roll matured that year. It became the album became the main art form. I mean, there is a good argument that had happened as early as 1965 when the Beatles did Rubber Soul and Dylan did Bring It All Back Home.
The album transitioning from the single?
Yeah, right. that rock and roll for the first 10 years of its life, sort of from Elvis through the beginning of the Beatles, the main medium was singles, and albums were just collections of singles. Albums weren't coherent works of art
so
themselves in the rock idiom.
Yeah, so what is it about that, about that idiom itself? It's really fascinating. About what was it, do you think, within the consciousness that sort of gestated in a way that said, okay, we can make this album into a complete work of art, and make it into a complete statement rather than just a 3 minute singles collected together. What was it that made it possible then? Was it just a change in consciousness, or was it a change in business, or was it just a change in viewing how music could be made, or what?
I think, like a lot of things in society, it was sort of a combination of several elements, including those ones that you mentioned. One aspect definitely was technology, that stereo recording became more complicated. What an artist could do became more complicated with the advent of multi-track recording, and the Beatles certainly were on the cutting edge of that. Also, the availability of stereos to consumers became much greater because the price dropped dramatically. Like a lot of things, when stereos first came out, they were very expensive. They were luxury items for wealthy people. And by the end of the 60s, there were these sort of portable stereo record players that were ubiquitous in college dorms. They were $100. KLH was the first big brand that was doing it. Headphones, which previously were only used by professional engineers, became a mass item. And radio changed in the United States. The advent of FM radio, which up until 1967 was sort of limited to classical music and farming reports and other very dry news stories. Literally, Modern Farmer was always listed in the New York Times as one of the big FM shows. And a change in FCC regulation that year required that if a station owned an AM and an FM station, they had to have distinctive separate programming for most of the time on the FM band. And there was a guy named Tom Donahue in San Francisco who had been a top 40 DJ, but who got caught up in the hippie scene and was loving albums. And one night, after listening to the Doors' first album, which ends with that 10-minute song, The End, he realized that there was no radio stations playing this music. They were playing the single on the Doors album, Light My Fire, but the experience of hearing that whole album, nobody was putting it on the radio. So he made a deal with kind of a almost bankrupt local FM station, started playing albums and album cuts instead of only the top 40. And overnight, it became the biggest station in San Francisco. That started in the spring of '67, and within a year, every major market in North America, there was a station playing albums where you could hear people like Jimi Hendrix and the Yardbirds, some blues records. It was a very free format the first couple of years, where you'd hear a Ravi Shankar Sea-Tour song followed by a folk song followed by a Beatles song, and this was an alternative media to top 40. and gave artists an incentive to make albums commercially. So there was the creative opportunity to do it because of technology. There was the example that was set particularly by Bob Dylan, that was changing pop music into a deeper kind of art. And there was the technological changes, and there was the sheer size of the generation that, every new generation wants to have their own thing that's different from their parents or older brothers or sisters. And albums became this, people always frequently referred to rock and roll as the soundtrack, or not just rock and roll, because R&B and what Motown was doing and
Sure.
was also part of that same soundtrack. It just became a much quicker way of translating what was happening in society to mass media. Movies would take years to do, but you could write a song and record it and put it out within a few months.
And it could and it could impact society so quickly, which kind of you just sort of pre-shadowed what my next thought was because of sort of the the singularity of media. And today media is so fragmented with social media and so many streaming channels to consume TV and read newspapers, and there's so many sources. Back then, you were talking about radio and the advent of FM radio coming into popularity and album covers, and there was sort of like more of a unified voice in media. So when a song broke, it really, really, like, everybody heard it. It was just the thing that you heard. So, you just were talking about Motown a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about civil rights and stuff. Do you think, and I know you talk about this in the book, but like the correlation between, black music sort of becoming mainstream and popular through Motown and through FM hits and things like this, did that affect the civil rights movement, do you think?
Well, there are different. I think there was definitely a relationship between music and the civil rights movement, and it's not just me that said that. People like John Lewis and Harry Belafonte and Martin Luther King, who were really leaders of the civil rights movement, have said it, and there were different aspects of it. Julian Bond, before he died, had a whole lecture that he would do about the connection between rock and roll, R&B, and the civil rights movement. One early aspect of it in the 60s, that prefigured the late 60s, was that rock and roll artists like Jackie Wilson and Little Anthony and the Imperials and Little Richard, these were black artists with white fans. And you would have some local TV shows like, the movie Hairspray shows what would happen when blacks and whites were dancing together. And that's a reflection of reality that pop music, even before the big album thing, the earlier 60s, earlier parts of rock and roll, was creating some integration among teenagers who were dancing to the same music. And that's just an extremely powerful language. You also had the tremendous influence of the blues on the mass rock and roll. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones, were very much indebted to R&B and blues. They covered songs by Marvin Gaye and Chuck Berry, and the Cream and the Yardbirds and the other British blues bands were all directly inspired by the blues. Bob Dylan's when he went electric, he had Mike Bloomfield and Barry Goldberg in his band. They had been guys from Chicago who played with people like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, put together a band called the Electric Flag. When the big kind of psychedelic rock show started in San Francisco, the prototype and most influential promoter was Bill Graham, who had the Fillmore East and Winterland. He got lists of blues and jazz artists from members of the Jefferson Airplane, from Jorma Kaukonen and Jack Cassidy, and would often have people like B.B. King, Albert King, Slim Harpo, Muddy Waters, John Lee Hooker opening or packaged with psychedelic rock. So there was a certain amount of connectivity And at the same time, there was a very separate lane of radio stations, then called R&B stations, whose main audience was black,
right,
and who had a more of a top 40 format, but who were still the vehicles through which people like the Supremes, the Temptations, Aretha Franklin, Booker T and the MGs, and Otis Redding would reach their audiences. So there was some overlap. I think it influenced white audiences more than black audiences. I think white audiences were expanding their taste and understanding black music better. I think black audiences who were listening to black radio were not hearing psychedelic music. Even Jimi Hendrix didn't get played much on
that's interesting.
on R&B radio stations. The one artist that seemed to be played on all the radio stations was Sly and the Family Stone. Sly Stone had been a DJ in San Francisco on an R&B station. His roots were R&B, but he had a front row seat to the psychedelic revolution, had an integrated band.
And his band was integrated, right?
And created a kind of a funk that both spoke very much the language of James Brown and the language of, the Jefferson Airplane at the same time. So he was one of the very few artists that really was a superstar in both the primarily black and the primarily white audience. So like everything in American race relations, there was real progress made. Music was part of it, but it was incomplete, and there was still a lot of segregation culturally. It's just a paradox, but there's just no getting around it. And then in sort of the alternative music area, you had a new kind of jazz that was influenced by the psychedelic world.
Like John Coltrane, you mean?
John Coltrane, very much so. He died in '67, and his legacy, he invoked, both Islam and Hinduism in his music, and was a huge influencer. You had the phenomenon, when Tim Leary first took acid, he gave some pretty soon to Allen Ginsberg, and then asked Allen to introduce him to artists because, like other pioneers of psychedelics, had the feeling that artists uniquely could process the psychedelic experience and communicate it. And among the first people they gave it to were Dizzy Gillespie and other jazz musicians. People like Ornette Coleman and Sun Ra, were really doing psychedelic jazz.
Yeah.
So, there were a lot of things happening all at the same time. I mean, one of the things I love about reliving 1967 was the richness, the intense dozens of layers, both politically, culturally, musically, and spiritually, that were kind of compressed and adjacent next to each other in a very short length of time. And that's where I kind of came up with the phrase lost chord, because that combination of energies just created this sense that there was some new way of being a human being and creating a sense of community. As I say, it was a brief period when peace and love wasn't meant ironically or cynically, but literally. And it didn't last long.
And it didn't
last long. Right. It was dead by 68. In many respects, but it did exist for a minute, and it lingers in some of our memories.
Well, I mean, yeah, and what's interesting about 67, and like you say, I mean, 68, of course, is marred with, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and, so many things starting to kind of turn sour. And of course, by the late 60s, things were getting kind of really ugly, and the Haight-Ashbury was kind of turning into a, just sort of like a street person,
Haight-Ashbury was pretty much ruined by the end of '67. Right. The Be-In was in January. It got this international publicity. People started talking about the Summer of Love, which was a media creation. It wasn't an actual thing.
Right.
But it drew an extra 100,000 people to San Francisco, and the systems couldn't contain that, and it attracted predators like Charles Manson and heroin dealers and damaged young people who didn't have a context to plug into. And, by the end of '67, it was an ugly place. I went out there to go to college at Berkeley in September of '67, went to Haight and didn't like it. I missed it,
Yeah, it was
it was the peak period. It was really 68 66 and the beginning of 67. And then it became a victim of its own success and vaporized and splintered into hundreds of different subcultures, some of which, became very, very important. And we're part of some of those subcultures.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I went
This podcast is part of reverberations from those subcultures.
I went to Dead and Company last night at the Hollywood Bowl. I mean, talk about part of that subculture. It was alive and very, very well.
But years later.
Yeah, over 50 years later. It's amazing. But so, within this year, within 1967, there's all of these things. I mean, we're talking about, music, the change in music and sort of, and how that was bubbling up. But then, there was also Eastern spirituality, which was, penetrating a lot of the hearts and minds of young people. But Eastern spirituality, like Paramahansa Yogananda and Vivekananda, those guys came a lot earlier. And all of these things sort of have maybe their like ancestral roots a little bit earlier. So what was it about the 60s that finally sort of gave way to critical mass? What was it about this
there's
year?
No question that all of the philosophies, esoteric and otherwise, that we think of as the 60s had been around for quite some time. In bohemian circles in America, you could go back to Walt Whitman. In England, to William Blake. In India, you could go back hundreds of years. There had been, as you say, yogis that came to the U.S., Yogananda and Vivekananda most well known. But in the West, those things were in small enclaves.
Right.
Greenwich Village, a section of San Francisco, certain college towns. They were a very small bohemian subcultures, as were the beatniks. Obviously, the beatniks in many ways were the precursors of some of the hippie ideas. The members of the Grateful Dead bonded because several of them had all loved Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Allen Ginsberg was such an inspiration to Bob Dylan that Dylan included him in the opening of his documentary, Don't Look Back, and so forth. But the difference about the 60s was these bohemian energies, which were the province of kind of small subcultures, collided with this gigantic baby boom generation and a mass media that wanted to cater to that generation, because one thing that has not changed is that media primarily runs on advertising money, and advertisers primarily are interested in younger people because that's when they believe brand preferences are made. And this was prior to the current young generation. The baby boom generation that came of age in the 60s was the largest in American history. And so you had, in addition to the rock records and FM radio stations and underground media, you had mass media like Time magazine and Life magazine, which were incredibly powerful. As you said, in those days, mass media was really concentrated. There were only 3 television networks and a handful of mass magazines that had 10 times the influence then that they have now. And they all covered Haight-Ashbury and the Beatles. I mean, in the end of 1966, Time magazine had people under 25 as the people of the year. Later in 67, they had a cover on the Beatles. They had a cover on hippies. Newsweek had Marshall McLuhan on a cover. All of the major networks did the big think pieces about hippies, war protesters. Some of them were cynical and snarky. Some of them were more sympathetic. But they put these energies that used to be limited to little coffee shops with 50 people of them into a mass culture where millions of people were suddenly thinking about things like this. So that's what was distinctive about the 60s. The ideas themselves were not new, but their presence in pop culture was unique.
Huh. Yeah. So, but was it just? I mean, I hear you say all this, but let's take the Eastern spirituality thing for a while, and you talk about the Hare Krishna movement, and I know, well, George Harrison's association with that came a little bit later. I mean, not right when Bhaktivedanta came and started it. It came a little bit, but what was it that was about that time that that movement could have not started any time sooner? It had to be then. It was exactly at the right time, I think so anyway. If he came in the 50s...
people had been chanting Hare Krishna, I'm sure, for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Thousands,
again, but they were mostly in India doing it. And very few kind of people that were kind of theology students or scholars of India might know these things and read books in an academic way.
Yeah.
But the prevalence, the psychedelic experience opened up a lot of people to questioning kind of the meaning of life, and some of them turned to Eastern religions. I would say the two most influential public figures in terms of bridging that were Allen Ginsberg and the Beatles. The Bhaktivedanta literally became known in America because of Allen. He came to the Lower East Side. He didn't know anybody. Josh Green has a fantastic biography of Bhaktivedanta that came out last year that tells this in a lot of detail. And by coincidence, Josh Green, who also sung with George Harrison on the Hare Krishna records that he made, was a high school classmate of mine. So,
he was? Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was a good source. One of many people I went to high school with who got into the culture.
He was one of the original devotees.
And well, Josh met him in Europe, in England. He didn't meet him in New York. He went to the Sorbonne, he transferred from the University of Wisconsin to the Sorbonne and was at a Paris disco where somebody played a recording of Hare Krishna that George Harrison had produced. That was not a hit record in America, but was actually a hit record in Europe. And he just went to meet him, went to London, and wanted to meet Bhaktivedanta, and was offered the chance to do so. And there were all these devotees there, and they said, "What do you do?" He said, "I go to college." He says, "Well, do you have any hobbies?" He says, "Well, I'm in a band. I play the organ." He said, "You're in a band?" He says, "Come with us right now." And they went to a studio, and it was Apple Studio, where they were about to record what was known as the Radha Krishna Temple album.
Yeah.
And he never went back to college. He says, this is why would I go back to college? I could hang out with George Harrison and sing Hare Krishna, but Bhaktivedanta got to New York, had found, some Indian relative gave him a little bit of money, and he rented this little storefront on the Lower East Side and had 10 people singing Hare Krishna. And they would go to Tompkins Square Park, and one day Ginsberg saw them doing it and started with them. And then the New York Times wrote an article about it, and the East Village Other put it on the cover because of Ginsberg. And then they did a recording, a very primitive recording, of that group of people singing Hare Krishna, and it was advertised in all the underground press with a one-line testimonial saying "brings instant ecstasy, Allen Ginsberg." And then when they opened their Haight-Ashbury temple, Allen met Bhaktivedanta at the airport and emceed a benefit that the Jefferson Airplane and Big Brother and the holding companies and other played to fund the temple.
Yeah.
The next night, and Bhaktivedanta had very strict rules for devotees, for his real devotees: no smoking, no drinking, no premarital sex, and so on. And Ginsberg said, "Look, I'm not going to give up smoking, but if it'll help, I'll say Hare Krishna every day for the rest of my life." Bhaktivedanta didn't condemn him. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, of course, right. Of course. He was smart.
But even bigger than Allen to me was the Beatles. It's hard to really put into words how big the Beatles were at this moment in time because, like you said, today's media is so fragmented. It's hard to imagine any artist being that big. But the Beatles were just omnipresent, people of many ages and all over the world. And they to be a kid and be a Beatles fan, once they started doing these psychedelic records where they were doing, on Revolver, John Lennon used lyrics I'm forgetting the name of the song now, but where he took direct quotes from the version of Tibetan Book of the Dead that Tim had published.
The Tomorrow Never Knows, yeah.
Notes. I mean, it was like line after line directly from that. So it wasn't a big leap to be a kid on acid and listen to that and say the Beatles must be taking acid, and the Beatles must be into this Eastern spiritual stuff. And of course, very quickly they were doing interviews saying that. So I would say, although these energies were these dots were going to be connected, and because of the effect psychedelics had on people and questioning things. And a lot of people who were questioning the meaning of life weren't getting the answers they wanted from Western religions at that moment.
Yeah.
Some did.
And Bhaktivedanta, even in your book, I mean, he says, hippies, you quote this, hippies are our best potential. Although they are young, they are already dissatisfied with material life and frustrated.
Right. And I think that's the key concept is, although a lot of people in established religions viewed the interest in Eastern spirituality as a rejection of Christianity and Judaism, I think much more it was a rejection of secular materialism that to me was really then as now the true dominant religion of the West and of the United States. That religions had become more tribal and cultural. Now, some of them are spiritual then as now, but for a lot of people, it wasn't a rebellion against their church or their synagogue. It was a rebellion against the idea that the purpose of life is to make money, have status, and accumulate external possessions.
Yeah.
And that although all of those things have their place, in my opinion, the worshiping of it to the exclusion of an inner world just didn't work for a lot of us. And psychedelics were a big part of that flip, although you didn't have to be on psychedelics to be a mystic. One of my favorite characters and the heroes of my book is Martin Luther King, who, as far as I know, never took psychedelics, but he didn't need to take them. He was already there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he was like Gandhi. I mean,
he was like a Gandhi. He was tuned into a level of mysticism when you listen to his sermons, not just his political speeches. And I don't think there would have been a civil rights movement of the 60s as we came to know it without a real Christian spirit that was not just an external set of traditions, but was a deeply felt, living spirit. So, and of course, Muhammad Ali, who is one of the great figures of the 60s and who turned against the war in Vietnam in 1967 and was reviled by a lot of the traditional sports writers and older black establishment and loved by younger people. He was a very spiritual Muslim. There was just no question that there was a spirituality intertwined with elements of the 60s, even though there were a lot of, angry secular protesters who didn't want to hear all that stuff.
Well, yeah.
When it was in balance, to me, is when it was at its best. When it got out of balance is when it kind of went downhill.
So Martin Luther King's sort of mysticism and and he was, for lack of a better word, a man of God. He was a deeply spiritual person. I mean, that had to play some role, all of this, all of this together. Like, had Martin Luther King not been, a spiritual person or a very respected, pastor and being deeply connected to, I guess, the scriptures in that sense, do you think his influence in the civil rights movement and him being because a lot of white folks, they ended up taking him very seriously. I mean, he penetrated the hearts and minds of everyone, even though, it took a while for civil rights to really break through. But, I have to think that so much of it is because of King. If it was any other leader, they wouldn't have had the same impact.
I think King is unique. At the same time, there were historical forces that created the climate for King. Obviously, sure. The black soldiers coming back from World War II were not as willing to be pushed around the emergence in the sports world of Jackie Robinson, the integration of baseball was one of the first signals of this new reality. And King in the 50s, when he did the Montgomery bus boycott, was in that historical context. And that was around the time, almost exactly the same time, as the Warren Court declaring school segregation to be unconstitutional. So there were other historical forces at play, but you put your finger on it that so many times in today's world we talk about the right wing, the Trump voters, the people, and I'll hear a lot of my friends will say, you just can't talk to those people. You can't change people. The idea is somehow to just rally all of our people, and that'll be more of us than of them. But King's career contradicts that assumption. People's hearts changed. He found a way of speaking from such a deep spiritual place that he reached millions and millions of white people who became energized and changed forever in their attitude about segregation once they were awakened to its immorality. And I don't believe that he would have had that level of impact without being a deeply spiritual person. Now, there were two levels to it. One is, as a practical matter, the black churches were the place you could organize in the South. There weren't other black organizations that had that relationship with the community. So that was a pragmatic fact of just the structure of the society. But beyond that, there was his particular connection to the Spirit, to Jesus, that was of a wholly other level and penetrated his vibe in a different way than most people that are preachers of any religion, because it's one thing to talk it, it's another thing to live it inside. And when you listen to some of his sermons, he was talking at a very mystical level, about he had this one line. He said, "Everything we see is but a shadow of that which we do not see." Mm-hmm. So, once you're getting into the area of acknowledging and relating to things that you can't see, you're in another consciousness. And that's different from just saying, here are the rules, obey them, or you're going to hell. He's an amazing figure. And of course, he existed. The hippies didn't particularly embrace Martin Luther King. I only came to appreciate him later because he would wear a tie and he was a preacher. And a lot of the black community by the end of the 60s thought he was passé. And, the 67 is the year when Stokely Carmichael popularizes the phrase Black Power. Malcolm X had great influence on people who questioned King's commitment to nonviolence. But King never departed from nonviolence. Yeah. And he was very clear about it. He didn't care what anyone said on the left or on the right. He didn't care what President Johnson said about it. He didn't care what some of the black militants said about it. He was not going to deviate from his belief in nonviolence, which was inspired by Gandhi and Tolstoy and Thoreau. And he was not having an easy time of it in 1967. When he came out against the war in Vietnam in April of 1967, he was attacked by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the NAACP. Most black civil rights leaders thought he had ruined things because he was pissing off President Johnson, who had pushed through civil rights bills. Johnson unleashed J. Edgar Hoover on him, J. Edgar Hoover had always hated him, but now the gloves were off. Yeah. There were black militants who thought he was old-fashioned. There were mainstream civil rights people who thought he was too radical, and he never deviated from his truth. To read what he was saying in the last year of his life is mind-blowing. It's so much more deeper, more substantive politically and spiritually than the things that we tend to hear on the celebration of the Martin Luther King Day holiday. And the fact that he was doing that at the same time that psychedelics were spread. Bob Dylan was reinventing lyrics, and it's pretty amazing collection of energies. And of course, like you said, he's then murdered in April of 68. So 67 was his last full year of life.
Gosh, that's amazing. And, also what I find so fascinating, you talked about how King's, anti-Vietnam sentiments were wildly unpopular, but, the reasons that when he was first starting to get into it, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote him, originally in like 1965 or something like that?
I think so. A.J. Muste was an elderly pacifist who had been against World War I and who was one of the idols, somebody that influenced King a lot and King respected a lot and was almost a teacher to him. And he knew of Thich Nhat Hanh and introduced them. And, King was learned a lot about Vietnam from him. And it helped clarify his opposition to the war in Vietnam, yeah.
Yeah, and then I just find that so fast because it really King's his view was so worldly. That's why I think his view on Vietnam, it made sense because he was looking at the world as a collective. Obviously, he was fighting for his people in this country, but what he was seeing with the Vietnamese monks being treated badly. I mean, him equating that to the civil rights movement here, it was just so much like Gandhi. Just seeing everything as sort of one big unified voice, and that's why we need to change things here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really, really interesting. So how'd you avoid the war, by the way? I meant to ask you earlier. How'd you not go?
I, like so many things in my life, somebody up there was looking over me. The year I turned 18 was the year where they had instituted what they called the lottery system, where depending on what day your birthday was, you had a number between 1 and 365. And anybody that had a higher number than a 300 or 280 or something was not drafted. So I had a high number. So I had all these different ideas about how to avoid the draft, your booklets you could get, whether you have a letter from a psychiatrist, registering as conscientious objector, and all these different things. But then I never had to execute any of those backup plans because I had a high number. But it's an interesting thing as we're speaking now. And you and I were privately talking about the Allman Brothers, and there was a period in the 80s when I managed the Allman Brothers, and I got to talking to Greg about the war in Vietnam, because one of the things that were in all the booklets that if nothing else worked, if you lost a toe, you were automatically 4F, and so the desperate last-ditch thing we would fantasize about was to cut off a toe. Now, nobody I knew cut off a toe. The people I went to high school with were middle-class or upper-class people that had access to psychiatrists. Many of them had student deferments, could figure out how to get around it. So it was just always one of those things that had been in the back of my mind as sort of as an extreme contingency no one will ever know. So I was talking to Greg about it, and he said, I shot my toe off. He said, me and my buddies, we had a toe shooting party. None of us wanted to go. We all got drunk and shot off our toes. I said, you actually did this? He says, yeah, definitely. He says, you want to see it? And then later on tour, a guy came backstage. He says, he'll tell you he was at the toe shooting party. Tell him that we really did it, So I didn't have to shoot off my toe. I just God decided to relieve me of yet another crisis. I had a high number in the lottery, but Greg Allman shot off his toe.
That is so. God rest his soul. Jesus.
God rest his soul.
That is really funny.
Yeah.
So, all of these great things. I mean, you're talking about 1967 spirituality and the civil rights movement, all these things, and this is just an amazing moment where, maybe a vision of a utopian, I don't want to say fantasy, but, maybe a utopian improvement, from the
certainly a utopian aspiration.
An aspiration, okay.
There was a feeling that the world could be a better place, that people could relate to each other in a more moral and humane and collective way. The word that was used a lot was in the Greek tradition, there were 3 different words for love. King spoke about a lot of this too. and one of them is interpersonal love, romantic love. One is the love of a brother and a friend, and then agape is the love for all humanity.
Yeah.
And there was this sense that agape could become part of the mainstream consciousness of the human race, and it didn't happen in the short term. No question about that. It influenced a lot of us, and I think there's some people I know who were my generation who have this sense of failure. And, the Trump election.
Yeah, but I want
to
ask about that, though, Danny, because, obviously I could see where the 60s, I'm not old enough to have been there, but I see where it went wrong. And obviously, I grew up with somebody who was, who was there at the front row and, got a lot of knowledge from that. But, I see all of these things that lived on over the years, the music, the spirituality. There's a yoga center and a mindfulness center on every block in Los Angeles now. So how did all of this happen? How did we go from that to electing Donald Trump, 6 months ago? I mean, how is that? What's your take? I mean, how could we have gotten that lost in the last 50 years?
Well, I think it's a question of, to say we didn't really create, but I think it's an important place to start the thought process about this is that there was a polarization then that infected things to this very day.
Yeah, I mean, Richard Nixon won in 1968. We can't forget that.
And some of that polarization correct. Richard Nixon won in 1968. Yeah. Donald Trump's campaign was very much, in many ways, patterned on some certain aspects of Richard Nixon's 68 campaign, and openly so. The so-called silent majority is a phrase he literally lifted from Nixon. The code words law and order. And the so-called Southern strategy, the unambiguous signal to white racists, were very, very similar. I think, though, that we have to look inside ourselves and what did we do wrong? Because we can't, that's all you can do is look at your own, learn from your own mistakes, and try to be better. And I think that there was a tribalism on our side that, in retrospect, was really counterproductive. I remember when I was a kid, we used to divide everybody up into straights and heads. In those days, straight was about did you get high or not on drugs. It didn't have a sexual connotation. And I used to look down on straight people. I thought they just didn't get it. They weren't as deep. They didn't understand the cosmic meaning of the universe. And I think a lot of that attitude came out of the culture writ large, a self-righteousness, a lack of compassion, a lack of inclusiveness. And people don't like being left out of the party. And I think that that even the word counterculture is polarizing. It's against something. So I think that there was a that I think the anti-war movement in particular was so fraught with different problems. Mm-hmm. One problem clearly was that the government and people like J. Edgar Hoover did everything they could to sabotage it. They had paid provocateurs who would come into these organizations and push the group into crazy, violent behavior that they knew would be unpopular with middle America. You had people that were emotionally damaged that were attracted to protest movements. Dr. King used to call them untransformed nonconformists, people that would do the right thing but not always for the right reasons.
Great phrase.
Yeah, an incredible sermon he gave about that. The vision was not at that time sufficient to include everybody, and it left a lot of people out, and the culture developed in different ways. A part of it, there's no question, was related to the civil rights movement and how painful the transition was, to the end of legal segregation, but that was part of a much longer problem, the original sin of America, slavery, the reverberations of which continue to be a very problematic for the society. We've never completely solved the problem, because you think of all the generations of abuse and damage and deprivation, and although there are a sizable number of African Americans who've been incredibly successful, there were the so-called underclass or the people in the poorest neighborhoods, have just not had the opportunities in education or healthcare and other job opportunities, all sorts of things that go with it. So, there was a polarization then as now. The human race, as long as recorded history, has dealt with the balance between fear and hope, between greed and generosity, between violence and nonviolence. These are not new problems. They weren't invented in the 20th century. The idea that they could all be solved in a single generation is naive. You also had in the 60s the split in the Democratic Party between the Cold War liberals and what were then called radicals. And today we see it, people would say, between corporate Democrats and progressives. And until there can be a shared, to put it in simplistic terms, until you can create a genuine coalition that involves mutual respect between people who supported Hillary in the primaries and people who supported Bernie. And I have friends in both camps who I have a hard time getting people to acknowledge the humanity and integrity of people in the other camp. And
likewise,
divide and conquer works. Fear works. Sometimes racism works sometimes. We also have a governmental structure that was built in the 18th century that's not a democracy. It's a republic that is undemocratic in many ways. You have millions of people who can't vote because they were convicted of felonies, a lot of them drug crimes, nonviolent drug crimes, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately poor people, disproportionately people who would otherwise vote Democratic. You have all these laws that make it hard to vote. You have an electoral college that gives people in Montana and Wyoming 10 or 20 times the power than people in New York or California. You have a Senate where, Wyoming gets 2 senators and so does California, even though California has, 20 times the population. Yeah. You have people who live in Washington, D.C., 90% of whom didn't vote for Trump, who don't count in the Electoral College, who don't have representatives in Congress. No, they do count in the Electoral College, but they don't have representatives in Congress.
Right.
You have a lot of flaws in the system, and you've got a human race that, just America alone. Look, I am very, very worried about the reverberations of the Trump presidency, and I just pray it doesn't lead to real deep, widespread violence and further deterioration as we speak. He just pulled out of the climate climate thing, the Parisian climate agreement, which is mind-boggling for a lot of us. But it's really ridiculous to pretend that he's the first bad president this country has had. I was brought up by parents who were horrified with Harry Truman for they felt he betrayed Franklin Roosevelt's vision of the New Deal and didn't really agree with the idea that he dropped not 1 but 2 nuclear bombs on civilian populations. Nixon, so many of the people who were influential on Trump were involved with Nixon. Anybody who hasn't seen it should go on Netflix and see the documentary Get Me Roger Stone, which is about one of Trump's closest advisors since the 80s, who was very close to Nixon, who got into politics in the Nixon campaign, who was very close to Roy Cohn, Senator McCarthy's advisor. Nixon killed millions and millions of people in Asia for reasons that really were related to some notion of national honor or ego that didn't actually in any way relate to American security, even under the terms of the Cold War. People were so worried about – I just finished Pat Buchanan, who was a big advisor to Nixon, wrote a memoir, which is a pretty good read, and to give that other point of view of people. And, Vietnam, we could have won in Vietnam. And I want to say to these people, dudes, Vietnam exists today. The North Vietnamese won it. It was the so-called communists, our so-called enemies, control that country. It's And Americans go there for vacations all the time.
Yes, they do.
There was like no terrorism, no hacking, no conflict at all. The so-called loss of Vietnam didn't in any way hurt the United States interests. So any argument that it was connected to our national interests, even if it was well-intentioned,
No.
I think a lot of it was fear and was not well-intentioned, but some of it was well-intentioned. But even the people who sincerely thought it was involved with our national interest, you would think today could admit it wasn't, because
no.
it was
Absolutely.
no domino effect. It didn't affect Japan or Australia or Indonesia or India.
It was left over from the Red
close
Scare.
ally of ours today,
Yeah.
Vietnam. The same people who quote unquote were our enemies. So so that was Nixon. Then you have Reagan, who shredded so much of the New Deal and the safety net. And then you had George W. Bush, who, for reasons that have yet to be explained, got us into a war in Iraq.
Yeah.
And you had deregulation under both Clinton and Bush that led to the financial crisis. So I don't think Trump is just an individual, isolated phenomenon. I think he represents an energy that's been there all along. And that if you want to deal with that, you've got to somehow, number one, have the patience to understand this is a long-term process, not look for instant gratification. You have to communicate to people that aren't in the bubble, that aren't listening to these podcasts or reading the New York Times or going to Grateful Dead concerts, but are still human beings who you have to actually make your case to them.
Yeah.
And some of them, if Martin Luther King could deal with the darkness that he confronted among Klan members and Southern racists and people who bombed churches, we could certainly, and he talked to them, then we have to be able to talk to them, and we have to get over our divisions internally on the left and learn the lessons and move on. And people who came before us dealt with a lot of worse situations than the situation that we're currently dealing with. We have to be inspired by them.
You make a great point about Martin Luther King and what he dealt with. If he could deal with that, we could certainly have a conversation with Trump voters. To say the least.
And they've been disappointed by, look, again, the split in the Democratic Party. They read all these statistics. Oh, the economy's better. But for most people, it didn't get better. They feel like it's a big scam. Of course, they think that's fake news because those statistics didn't correlate to their own personal experiences in large parts of the country. And there was not a very good outreach on the part of the people that we supported. I'm very proud to have voted for President Obama twice, but he was not perfect.
And it is true. The fact remains it is absolutely true. There's the huge, what we used to refer to as sort of the blue collar working class belt of this country is decimated. It's true. We don't live in those communities. You and I, we live in urban centers where we don't see it. But it's true. You go to those places, and their entire fabric, their entire the iron that bound them together is crumbled. And they're looking for answers. I get that. I do get that. Danny, your book, In Search of the Lost Chord.
Anyway, so it's
out.
Hello?
Oh, you're still there.
I'm still here. I'm very grateful to be on the podcast, Zach, and
thank you.
Be able to hawk the book. I'm very proud to be part of a community that's tried to make things better. We screw up a lot, but I still think that if you come from a place of peace and love over time, you're going to feel good about the results of your life. And
if you go to Amazon, you can get the book. And
it's available wherever books are sold.
Okay. Danny, thanks for coming.
Thank you, brother.